Hi guys, welcome back. This is part 3 now because I uploaded part 2 at I think 12:45 this morning, and then that was really late actually because even YouTube left this little boxy comment thing that was like, most of your followers are asleep or not active at this time, and I was like, yeah. But then I was feeling the pressure because everyone was like, Danny, where is part 2? And I was like, I'm just gonna post it now since I was supposed to post it on Friday, but I took a little R&R and went on a little staycation with Gabby. So when I did this video, or part 2, I broke down all the court documents, but all my notes on the court documents I just had written in video slideshows. And about 90% of the comments on the last video were, I multitask when I watch your videos, so having words on a screen isn't gonna work for me. So I'm gonna do this video again. I'm not gonna change much except read the points that I made so that you guys can hear me instead of just playing a slideshow. So let's start this over again. Yay. So I'm just gonna go ahead and tell you who some of the suspects were. I didn't get all of them because, as I said, the records are still sealed. There's not that much information online still about this case. But Ty McNeill was another suspect who was Faith's ex-boyfriend, who she dated on and off again for 2 years. Friends of Faith said that Ty was abusive, he was jealous, he was overprotective. If Faith didn't answer her phone, he would show up at the apartment to make sure that she was there. There was one time she left her phone on her bed when she was downstairs doing laundry, and he showed up, broke into the laundry room, threw up against the wall in the laundry room. He was abusive, he was scary, he was not a good dude. So he was a suspect. Uena Chavez, who was a friend of Faith's, told police that days before Faith was murdered, she confided in her that she wanted to get back with her high school sweetheart, Alex Demery. And she said no way in hell would she ever get back with Ty. However, the same week she was murdered, she had sex with Ty and actually had plans with Ty the day she went to Thrill. He called her and texted her that morning and asked if they still had plans for that evening. She never responded. She ignored him. He didn't call or text her after that. Some believe that maybe Ty found out that she was at Thrill, went to her apartment, they got into a tit for tat, and he ended up killing her out of jealousy. And it just happened to be when Karina wasn't home. At 3:43 in the morning, a text was sent from Faith's phone to Ty stating the following: I know you're probably sleeping, but I just wanted to let you know that not a day goes by that you don't cross my mind, and I know that it will be like this for the rest of my life. Sorry for being in my feelings, but hey, we all have feelings. Friends of Faith said that that's not how she spoke, especially to Ty. She was a grammar spaz, and the way that text was sent was not how she would type out her text. So they believe someone else sent that text to Ty from Faith's phone. If I'm looking at Ty as a suspect, if I killed my girlfriend, my ex-girlfriend, and I don't want people to think it was me, I would text myself from her phone. So if Ty was a suspect, that kind of makes sense. But at the same time that text was being sent, a couple minutes before that, she texted Brandon, Karina's ex, from her phone. That shit don't make no sense. So the text could also have been sent from Karina, from Faith's phone, to Ty to make Ty look guilty. There's so many different possibilities there. I couldn't find online what happened with Ty, if he agreed to offer up his DNA, if he didn't agree. He has not been arrested, no one's been arrested, but I don't know if he was ever tested or was ever officially a suspect. And if he wasn't, hello police, you should probably make him one. So here are my notes on Ty McNeill, the first suspect in Faith's murder. Except I don't know if Ty was ever officially a suspect, but he's a suspect in my book. He was reported to be abusive, controlling, and obsessive. It could be possible that Ty got upset that she ignored him, bailed on him, and found out that she was at the club, went to her house, got into a fit of rage, killed her in some type of crime of passion, but then the note left on the bed wouldn't really make any sense. There are no, and I mean zero, court documents about Ty McNeill online in regards to Faith's murder. I have also not read anything online that says that he was ever named a suspect or even questioned. So that's a big question mark. Was he asked to give DNA? And if he was asked to give DNA, did he comply? Faith and Ty were together for almost 2 years, on again, off again. Regardless, that's a long time to be messing with somebody. And nowhere online did I personally see anything. I don't even know what Ty McNeill looks like because it's almost like this guy doesn't exist. But I saw absolutely nothing online of Ty begging the public or pleading with the public in help bringing justice to Faith, helping to find her murderer. If a man is in love with a woman, and is possessive and obsessive and whatever he was with Faith, wouldn't you think that if his love or his ex-girl got murdered, you would be hitting the streets and banging down doors trying to figure out who killed her? So that's a little suspect to me. I just feel like, wouldn't he be devastated had he not been guilty of something? Jacob Beatley, who was the man who allowed Karina to sleep at his house the night of Faith's murder, didn't get tested till 6 months after Faith's murder, and he was very reluctant to give his DNA. He said he did not want to be involved, he had nothing to do with it. However, his cell phone got pinned right by Karina's apartment after 4:30 in the morning, which was when Karina was supposed to be sleeping there. So if Karina's sleeping at your apartment, why is your cell phone being pinned by Faith's home? He could have known that Faith was there by herself and went back to the apartment. He did tell police that Karina came over and had a red stain on her shirt, and he asked her if the stain was blood. Investigators flipped Jacob's apartment upside down looking for the shirt. They found it, and it has not been revealed in the police report whether or not that the stain on the shirt was blood, and if it was blood, if it was Faith's blood. If it was Faith's blood, that means that Karina would have been present during Faith's attack and murder and was involved. Motherfucking Jacob Beatley, bro. I'm just gonna read this because again, it's another long typed up form from an officer that must have done the interviews with Jacob Beatley. But when I originally filmed this video, I thought that Jordan was picking up Karina and bringing him to another dude's house, but in this report, Jacob actually is roommates with Jordan, so they live together. But this is the report that the police officer wrote. Just prior to March 1st, 2013, Lieutenant Smith was reviewing cell phone records in a cell tower dump which was conducted earlier in this investigation. Lieutenant Smith found an incident report associated with the number in the cell tower dump that was connected to a blank who lives at blank, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Lieutenant Smith brought this to my attention as the listed address was a primary focus during the early stages of this investigation. I told him that the name did not sound familiar to me. This call from blank phone was made during the early morning hours of Friday, September 7, 2012 at 4:15 a.m., which fits the targeted location, date, and time frame specified in the cell tower dump. This particular call suggests that Blank's cell phone was in the target area and that he was most likely the person in the possession of the phone. Additionally, it should also be noted that Faith Hedgepeth's roommate, Karina Rosario, left the apartment on Friday, September 7th, 2012 at approximately 4:27 a.m. after she was picked up by her friend Blank, also resides at Blank with Blank, and Karina left the Hawthorne at the View apartment complex and drove to the Blank address where they stayed for the remainder of the night. These facts, along with the phone call, suggest that Blank may have known that Faith was in the apartment alone or was about to be. Lieutenant Smith did some research to Blank and discovered another incident report involving him from the year 2010, in which a police officer from New Albany, Ohio, contacted Chapel Hill from Ohio. The officer further reported that Blank had made some threatening statements to his mother's boyfriend in New Albany, and they believed that he might be in possession of a stolen handgun. According to the reporting officer, Blank was a UNC student, but he'd recently withdrawn from school and was still living at Blank, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Blank allegedly had begun to exhibit mental health concerns and was being treated in Ohio. The reporting officer further reported that Blank and his mother got into an argument and she kicked him out of her house. After that, it was reported that he sent his mother a text message implying he intended to shoot her boyfriend in the head. The boyfriend reported to Ohio police that he was unable to locate his Smith & Wesson 9mm handgun and believed that Blank might have it. No additional details are available regarding this report. On March 1st, 2013, Lieutenant Smith and I drove to Blank where he spoke with Blank. He answered the questions on our questionnaire and also stated that he was at the Thrill during that early morning hours of Friday, September 7th, 2012. Jacob said he drove home after leaving the club where he stayed for the remainder of the night. I asked him what time he left the club that night, but he couldn't recall. I asked Blank to submit a sample of his DNA, but he seemed hesitant to do so. Blank said that he wanted to consult with his dad first and done so via cell phone while he sat in the car with us. After their conversation ended, Blank stated that his dad wanted to consult with an attorney before allowing him to submit a sample. I reminded Blank that he was an adult and could submit a sample without his dad's permission, and also reassured him that he had nothing to worry about as long as he had nothing to do with Faith's death. Blank eventually decided to wait on a response from his dad. He also said that he would be in touch with me in a few days and would let me know what he decided. I told Blank that was fine and then gave him my business card with my contact information. Lieutenant Smith and I left Blank residence and drove back to the police department. Several days went by and I never heard from Blank. I left him several voicemails and sent him a few emails asking him to contact me. I never received a response. On April 5th, 2013, Lieutenant Smith and I drove back to Blank's residence to try to talk with him, but one of his roommates said that he wasn't available. We drove back to the police department, where I later received an email from Blank stating that he did not want to submit a sample of his DNA. So Mr. Jacob Beatley is now looking like he could also be a suspect. It was allegedly that Karina had a romantic relationship with Jacob, but maybe her romantic relationship was with Jordan. And maybe, but then it's like it all comes back to Karina leaving her door unlocked. And then also the attack was personal. Why would Jacob, who at this point doesn't seem to have a prior relationship with Faith, go to Faith's apartment, beat her to death, and leave some type of angry note? It just doesn't add up to me, but his behavior is also really suspicious. Like, if you're not guilty, dude, if you had nothing to do with her death, why wouldn't you submit a sample of your DNA? Why have your roommates tell cops that you weren't home when you were probably hiding in your closet? So Jacob was looking insignificant earlier. I mean, the pin off the cell phone is a little sketchy to me. But again, it could have been that it was Jacob that actually picked up Karina and not Jordan. Everyone could be lying. At this point, it seems like everyone is lying. But this search warrant and his refusal to give DNA, because I said prior that I had no clue if he gave DNA. The answer is no, he did not. Also, earlier I stated about how he said Karina was wearing a shirt with blood on it, and none of that information is in the legal documents that are available to the public, which makes me think again that Karina is deeply involved in this because Jacob ratted her out. But if Jacob ratted her out, why is he not giving his DNA? And why can't we know if the stain on Karina's shirt was actually blood? And if it was blood, was it Faith's? Why is none of that in the documents? I'm thinking that part of the case is sealed again. And I think it's sealed again because investigators don't want to fuck up their chances of catching the people that are actually involved. Jacob, mother Beatley. Jordan brought Karina back to him and Jacob's apartment where she spent the remainder of the night. How convenient. My question is, was Jacob actually in the car with Jordan when Jordan picked up Karina? Or was he just conveniently in the same area by Faith and Karina's apartment at the same time Karina was being brought to his house to spend the rest of the night? Whatever the answer is, one solid truth remains, and that is Jacob Beatley was in fact by Faith's apartment at around the time the crime was committed. Police believe that Jacob in fact knew that Faith would have been at the apartment alone by herself, because obviously Karina left and headed to Jacob's house with his roommate Jordan. So that's why they were looking at Jacob as a suspect. I, however, firmly believe that Faith was dead before Karina left the apartment at around 4:25 in the morning. Which brings the question as to why the time of death in Faith's murder has never been revealed. Because if her time of death was before 4:25 in the morning, that would prove to law enforcement and to us, the public, that Karina actually did have something to do with it, or and if she didn't, she knows who did. But if she knows who did, it means that she had something to do with it as well. But I just don't understand why her time of death has never been released or revealed. Like in every Law and Order SVU episode that we ever watched, the time of death is like almost determined right when the medical examiner shows up at the crime scene, right, Gabby? Mm-hmm. They're like, she's been dead for roughly 10 to 15 hours. Yet we have no idea what Faith's time of death was. But if we could pinpoint what Faith's time of death was, whether that's before 4:17 in the morning when Jacob made a call around their apartment, or before 4:25 in the morning when Karina left the apartment with Jacob's roommate. Why don't we have that information? Jacob Beatley also had a record or an incident on file with a completely different police department for a completely different matter. So you could say that he has a little bit of a criminal past, criminal record. It also says that Jacob was starting to exhibit mental health problems. In these court documents, it doesn't state what mental issues he was suffering from, but it did say that he withdrew from school and his behavior was starting to become irrational. A person suffering from mental illness who isn't getting the proper care may become irrational, maybe even violent. The FBI did state that a potential suspect could be someone that knew Faith, had been watching Faith for a while, and a possible scenario is Jacob had a thing for Faith. Maybe he liked Faith, and maybe Faith rejected him, and that rejection set off a trigger to his mental illness that made him irrational and become violent with her. But then it's like the note on the bed wouldn't make any sense unless Karina was really good friends with Jacob, and in private she would complain all the time about how she was jealous of Faith or angry with Faith, and he was starting to think in his mind, how can I make this look like it's not me, I had nothing to do with it, and he left that note on the bed to make it seem like it was Karina. I don't know, just a possible scenario. Jacob had previously texted his mother about how he intended to shoot her boyfriend in the head. This text proves that Jacob has a very dark and violent side and maybe would resort to violence or murder if provoked. And maybe Faith at some point provoked him. Jacob's mother's boyfriend reported his handgun missing, and he told police he believed that Jacob is the one that stole his handgun. When I read this, two things came to my mind. Number one, when they allegedly searched Jacob's apartment for Karina's stained shirt, did they find the missing gun of his mother's boyfriend, or did they find any weapons at all? Two, if shooting someone is his MO or his go-to or his threat, wouldn't he have shot Faith and not bludgeoned her to death? It's also important to note that Jacob was at the Thrill on the night in question, and he doesn't recall what time he left the nightclub. Jacob also ignored calls, emails, and texts from detectives, and even told his roommate to tell officers that he wasn't home or available when they showed up to his house trying to collect a sample of DNA. Now, if Jacob is not guilty and had nothing to do with Faith's murder, why would he refuse to give a sample of his DNA? Those are actions of a guilty-ass mother, if you ask me. He eventually emails the detective and says, "Hey, buddy, I'm not giving you that sample of DNA." And in the detective's mind, and in my mind, when I'm reading these court documents, I'm thinking, why wouldn't you want to clear your name? Okay, cool, you might have stolen your boyfriend's handgun, maybe done some other illegal shit, but now we're talking about possible first-degree murder. Don't you want to clear your name on that if in fact you had nothing to do with it? Here's another question that just popped to my head. If they in fact searched Jacob's apartment, home, wherever he lived with Jordan, looking for Karina's stained shirt, and for whoever did not watch my part 1 of this video, there was an instance where Jacob told police that Karina came over with a stain on her shirt and he didn't know if it was blood, so allegedly they tore his apartment upside down looking for this stained shirt, and they actually did find it, but it's never been released if in fact the stain on her shirt was blood, and if it was blood, whose blood was it? We just have no clue. It's not in these court documents at all either. But the question is, if in fact they did search Jacob's apartment for this stained shirt, couldn't they have collected DNA in his house through the search warrant from a hairbrush, a used water bottle, a Starbucks coffee cup he just threw away in the trash? Because in Law & Order SVU, when people don't want to give their DNA, you know, cops stay posted up, they wait for the dude to throw like a yogurt and a spoon in the trash, and they scoop that yogurt and spoon in the trash and they bring it on down to the lab. So if in fact they did search Jacob's crib for Karina's stained shirt, couldn't they have collected a sample of Jacob's DNA through the warrant? And then if they collected his DNA through this search warrant, couldn't they have just compared that DNA to the semen found on the crime scene to either rule him out or rule him in? Or did they search the apartment just for the shirt and just not collect any DNA of his? Or was there never a search at all? In the distorted voicemail that I put in part 1, there is a section of the audio that an analysis deciphered, and it had a male speaking, and it says inaudible, get the duct tape next to inaudible, then they can tie up Faith. If this voicemail was in fact recorded during Faith's attack and murder, then the use of the word they confirms that there were multiple people present and also accessories to a murder. The person who did analysis on the voicemail said that he heard 2 male voices and 2 female voices, but even though he only heard a total of 4 voices, it doesn't doesn't mean that there weren't more people there. They could have been in and out of whatever room they were in, downstairs, grabbing the duct tape. I personally believe that there was at least 6 people involved. 5 to 6. Definitely more than 4. And it's looking like Jacob Beatley was one of them. So here's a possible scenario that I came up with. Possibly Jacob and whoever he was with at the Thrill went back to Karina and Faith's apartment or somebody else's apartment. But let's just say they went back to Karina and Faith's apartment. At some point, a argument started up between Faith and Karina about some guy that was either present at the Thrill or at the apartment. Faith was then attacked by Karina and the men that were at the apartment instead of trying to break up the fight. I don't know if you would consider that maybe a setup. Maybe Karina set this whole thing up. She got dudes at the apartment that already had an issue with Faith for whatever reason. I don't know. I don't know how Karina would have gotten all this to go down, but every single person at the apartment had to have had an issue with Faith because not one person tried to stop her murder. So Karina and Faith start arguing. The men at the apartment now are joining Karina in causing physical and bodily harm to Faith. And one of the men involved was Jacob. We don't know if in fact she was raped because they did not release the autopsy reports. We don't know if she was raped, if it was by multiple people. But we do know that during her attack, it is possible that one or more people restricted her, tied her down while she was beaten and or sexually assaulted. And I believe one of those people might be Jacob. I do believe in my hearts of hearts that the fatal blow to her head with the Bacardi peach rum bottle was inflicted by Karina, and I believe that Karina is the actual killer. Although I do believe she had help in basically torturing her before she died. Once Faith was dead, I believe that the killer or killers took time to clean themselves up and clean up some of the apartment, because remember, there was absolutely no blood outside of the bedroom. Not on the door handle, not in the living room, not in the kitchen. The only blood was in the bedroom, which means that whoever killed Faith took their time to clean themselves up. So whoever was involved, or I just thought of this, Faith began to be attacked not in their apartment. And when they finally got back to the apartment, she probably tried to book it and escape, and that's when someone picked up the bottle of Bacardi and bashed her in the head with it. That could explain why there was no blood outside of the bedroom, and also why no neighbors heard anything. Because if someone's being raped and tortured before they get bludgeoned in the head, wouldn't somebody in one of the apartments close by hear something? Or no? Because I have neighbors who like literally scream at their kids, and I'll be in my bedroom in a deep, deep sleep and that shit'll wake me up. I hear it. The walls are very thin, so it's just a little strange to me that absolutely no one in her apartment complex heard anything. So that's a possible scenario. But either way, I believe after Faith got hit in the head with the Bacardi bottle and blood started going everywhere, these killers decided that they needed to clean themselves up and the apartment. I then believe that a possible scenario is that after they cleaned up, Jacob went to his car, got in his vehicle, called his roommate Jordan, asked Jordan if he could pick up Karina from Karina's apartment. That's why his phone was pinned at 4:17 in the morning by Faith's apartment, because he wanted it to look like Jordan was picking up Karina and that Jacob and Karina were not together at the time of the murder, but rather just a random sleepover. Or Jordan was also at the apartment and was also involved, but it wouldn't explain why Jacob's phone was pinned around Faith's apartment at 4:17. What would make sense is that Jacob went to his vehicle, called Jordan at 4:17 in the morning, told Jordan to come get Karina. Jordan was like, oh, man, but doing what a good roommate does, was like, all right, I'll go get her. Picked her up, brought Karina back to the crib, and then Jacob then met them at the crib so that they could be each other's alibi. Jacob may have not killed Faith on his own, but there is absolutely a chance that he was involved in whatever happened to Faith. There's an even bigger chance that he was at Faith's apartment at the night in question, and so is his DNA, hence why he refused to give a sample. Jordan, who picked up Karina to bring her to Jacob's house, it's very unclear to me whether or not he was ever a suspect or if his DNA got tested. I could not find anything about this dude and his involvement, or if he's possibly involved, but he also would have have known that Faith was home alone because he picked up Karina, brought him to Jacob's house, and could have brought his ass back to Faith and Karina's apartment to do whatever he wanted to her. But it's unclear. I could not find online if he was ever tested, and if he was tested, obviously he was not a match because no one has been a match as of yet. David Bell was the man who was walking out of Thrill nightclub with Faith on the night of her murder. He got questioned by police. He told police that he didn't know Faith well. He met her that night. They danced at the club. He was there with his boys, and that was that. I, again, could not find online if he was a suspect or if his DNA was ever tested, but I know for a fact he was questioned. There is a affidavit for non-testimonial identification procedure, and this, I believe, is for David Bell. David Bell's name was leaked on the internet as the last man that was walking out of Thrill nightclub with Faith, and it says in this document, blank was identified as walking out of Club Thrill with Faith Hedgepeth shortly before the homicide occurred. He was the last male to be seen with her before her death. He admitted to talking to her on the night of the homicide and to meeting her the weekend before. Blank refused to offer DNA, stating that he may have touched her the night of the homicide. His statements to law enforcement officers were inconsistent with statements given by others. And then it just reminds us that unknown DNA was recovered at the scene of the homicide of Faith Hedgepeth. The buccal swab from Blank for DNA comparison is of material aid in determining if Blank may have committed the offense. And this is where things got confusing for me when I was reading at 2 a.m. But this is about Thrill nightclub and men that were at Thrill. So try to bear with me because these all have black lines through them. Names are scribbled out. I don't know who is talking about who, but I will read and I will give my opinion. So let's go. In this section coming up, these are the court documents in relation to David Bell, who was the man seen on security footage walking out of the Thrill nightclub with Faith on the night she was murdered, and also the people that he was with when he was at the Thrill. In these court documents, it's really hard to understand because almost every single name in the documents is blacked out. I do my best in trying to understand what these court documents are trying to say, but again, the names are blacked out. I can only go off what I'm assuming and guesses. Hopefully I did a good job breaking this down, and if you guys notice something different than what I noticed, feel free to comment that in the comment section. Recently, Lieutenant Smith and I have been reviewing the video footage from the Thrill. The footage shows Faith Hedgepeth leaving the nightclub at closing time with an unidentified male. The footage also shows the same unidentified male entering the club earlier in the evening with 3 other men, all of whom seem to be together as a group. Lastly, the footage at the end of the video shows a former employee, Chris Wright, talking to one of the 4 men in the group. I spoke to Wright earlier in the investigation after finding out that he was a roommate of Blank. Loftus was a co-worker of Faith Hedgepeth at the Red Robin. I don't even know who Wright is. He's not mentioned in anything before. Now, who the f is Loftus, you guys? I didn't read that name anywhere, so obviously this is another suspect. When I read these court documents, I'm assuming that the unidentified male seen walking into the Thrill with 3 other men walking out to the club with Faith on the night in question is David Bell. This is the first time in my research of Faith's case that I see the name Chris Wright. Chris Wright used to work at the Thrill. He's a former employee. I'm unsure of what his job was, but he is seen on security footage that police have talking to a man in the group of friends that was with David Bell on the night in question. My question here is, how do the police have security footage from the Thrill of Chris Wright talking to one of the men in the group of friends with David Bell on the night in question if it's been stated that both the club footage and the parking lot footage was destroyed and recorded over? So if that's the case, how do they have footage from inside the nightclub? And why haven't we seen it? Police officers state that they interviewed and questioned Chris Wright early on in the investigations because they found out that he was roommates with Blank. Now, after this sentence in the documents, the next sentence starts with the name Loftus. I'm assuming Loftus is the last name of the man Chris Wright was roommates with. So I did a little digging and I found that Jim Loftus is probably the Loftus that they're talking about, who used to be co-workers with Faith at Red Robin. Now again, it's important to remember that the FBI stated that the person that killed Faith could be someone that has known her for a while, has been watching her, was possibly rejected by her. So if Jim Loftus is somebody that worked with Faith at Red Robin, it is possible that whoever this Jim Loftus guy is could have made advances towards Faith. Maybe on the night in question, she rejected him, turned him down, and maybe that pissed him the fuck off and he killed her. So is Jim Loftus also a suspect? Is Chris Wright also a suspect? And why is Chris Wright the only name out of all these court documents that isn't blacked the fuck out? Did Chris Wright submit a sample of DNA? Did Jim Loftus submit a sample of DNA? Were either one of these dudes suspects? We don't know, and it's damn sure not in these court documents. March 6, 2013. I called Chris Wright to set an appointment to view video from The Thrill. We met later in the afternoon, and Lieutenant Smith showed him different segments of the video. One segment showed 4 men entering the club together. The one who enters the club first appears to be the same man who exits the club with Faith Hedgepeth. The 4th man also appears near the end of the video footage talking to Chris Wright. We asked Wright if he knew the 4 men, and he said he didn't think so. We showed him the footage of him talking to one of the men, which was a better angle, and he said he thought the man he was talking to blank. Wright also identified another man that he knows, blank. He also identified one of the men in the group as a guy he played basketball with who attended NC Central Law School, but doesn't know his name. Wright provided contact numbers for blank, blank, and blank. Wright left. Later, I received a call from Wright who said after talking to his friend blank, they believe the man that Wright was talking to was a guy named blank, who is also a law student at NC Central. This was interesting since one of the men Wright pointed out on the video was another law student. Our conversation ended and I went to Facebook where I found blank's page. I searched his friend's page and found that he is friends with blank. I looked at photos on both of their pages and found a guy in the photos named blank that resembles the man walking out of Thrill with Faith. He too is friends with both blank and blank. At this point, 3 of the 4 men may be identified. I'm still very unclear and unsure of Chris Wright's role in this entire story. However, he does seem like he's cooperating with police. He doesn't seem like he's combative, but I will note that as I'm reading the police statements, at the beginning, police showed Chris footage and asked if he knew these 4 men. Chris said no. Then the police show him the security footage from a different angle, and then Chris changes the story up and he's like, oh, I actually do know them. And he identifies 3 out of the 4 men and even gives the police contact numbers for a few of the men. It's just a little sketchy to me that at first he told police he didn't know who the group of men was, and then he switched his story real quick when they showed him on camera talking to one of the men. Why would he lie there? What was Chris Wright trying to hide there? I appreciate that he was eventually helpful, but at first he was a little deceptive. Chris Wright tells police that the 4th dude he's played basketball with before, but he doesn't know him and doesn't know his name. My brother was a ball player growing up. I went to pretty much all of his AU games, his courtside games, his high school games, and the entire time they're playing basketball, all these men are yelling and screaming each other's names and nicknames at each other. So the entire time you're playing basketball with a mother Chris, you didn't hear his nickname or his name yelled once? You didn't get introduced to him once? Just doesn't really sound believable to me whatsoever. Very sketchy. Big question mark there. He knows the mother's name, or at least his nickname. Ain't nobody gonna play ball with someone a bunch of times and not know at least his nickname. Chris then called police back, but only after calling and speaking to his friend, whose name was blacked out in the documents, so I'll just say friend blank, and informed police that him and his friend believed that the mysterious basketball player, whom he didn't know the name of, was blank. Again, another name that's blacked out in the court documents, who is also a law student. So, when Chris Wright originally identified 3 out of the 4 men that he was talking to at the Thrill, he said one of them was a law student, and now this basketball player who he didn't know the name of but now thinks he knows the name of is also a law student. So out of David Bell's group of friends, 2 of them are law students. Although Chris Wright seems a little sketchy to me, made a couple of hiccups, maybe a couple of white lies here and there, he did lead investigators to a Facebook page, and that Facebook page identified 3 out of the 4 men that were on the security footage, including David Bell, for the night in question at the Thrill. So whether Chris was trying to protect someone or maybe was scared in interrogation, his information did lead police to a Facebook page that confirmed the identity of 3 of the 4 men that were seen walking into the Thrill, and one of those men was David Bell. Lieutenant Smith and I were on our way to the Wake County Jail to talk to a former Red Robin employee, Blank, when we discovered that he was released from jail yesterday. We were near the airport at the time and decided to go back to the police department. So in this portion of the court documents, I'm assuming that the former Red Robin employee was the name that was mentioned earlier, Loftus. Jim Loftus was an employee at Red Robin. At the same time, Faith was an employee at Red Robin. Clearly, he was in jail. He had a criminal record and a criminal past outside of Faith's murder. Loftus was in jail for a completely different offense outside of this investigation. So what that proves to me is that Jim Loftus is obviously someone that has a criminal past, maybe a violent past, and maybe a dangerous dude. And this dangerous dude, with clearly a criminal past, worked at Red Robin with Faith. Again, not a lot is mentioned in these court documents about this sketchy ass motherfucker Loftus, but he's looking like he could possibly be a suspect to me, especially if he was at the Thrill on the night in question. March 8th, 2013. I called the number listed for Blank and received his voicemail. I left a message for him to call me. Later, Blank called me back and we scheduled a meeting at the police department at 1300. Blank arrived and we showed him the footage from Thrill. Blank believes that the guy who was seen talking to Chris White is Blank. Blank also identified another man who plays soccer at UNC. Blank, I completed a questionnaire with Blank, and he also submitted a sample of DNA. One of the guys came in and submitted a sample of his DNA, but his name is blocked out, so I don't know what guy it was. In this portion of the court documents, one of the men from the group that was at the Thrill with David Bell was identified by police, came in, got questioned by police, did a questionnaire, gave a sample of his DNA, and also confirmed other men that were in the group at the Thrill that evening. Now the name is blacked out. I have no idea what guy out of this group of friends came in, gave a sample of his DNA, and also helped identify the other men he was with. I don't have a clue. Also wonder if the UNC soccer player that this guy, don't know his name because again it was blacked out, pointed out in the footage was Jordan. Because don't forget that Jacob's roommate Jordan was in fact a former UNC soccer player. And it's never been stated whether or not Jordan was at the Thrill on the night in question with or without his roommate Jacob. We know Jacob was there, but how come it's never been mentioned whether or not Jordan was also there too? But this guy who came in, got questioned by police, gave a sample of his DNA, also identified other men on the security footage, including a UNC soccer player. Was that Jordan? Who was the soccer player? Again, the name is blacked out. It would be just so much easier if they just gave us the documents with people's actual names in it. Why are their names being protected? I don't understand. I then decided to pull over and call Blank and Blank. I called Blank and received his voicemail. I left a message for him to call me. Moments later, I received a phone call and it was Blank. I told Wright, so his last name must be Wright, I was investigating the death of Faith Hedgepeth and asked if he knew her. So there's another suspect with the last name Wright. Blank stated that he didn't really know her, but remembers seeing her at Thrill that night. I asked him who was with him that night and he stated blank, 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 and another guy who he didn't know by name, but explained that he used to room with blank and blank. It's so confusing because there's so many blanks. I asked Blank where he was and who he was with the night prior to going to the Thrill. Blank said that he attended a function and then went to the apartment that Blank and Blank share. I asked him who was at the apartment and he said blank, 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 and the unknown former roommate. Blank said when they left the apartment, Blank rode with him, and the other 3 men rode together in a separate car. I asked Blank if they made any stops along the way, and he said no. Blank said they arrived at the Thrill and went inside, where he eventually saw Faith. Blank further stated that he left the club that night after it closed and drove back home to Raleigh, North Carolina, alone. Blank said that blank, 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 and the unknown roommate drove back to Durham together. After reading these court documents, I am under the assumption that blank in this portion of the documents is referring to the man whose last name is Wright. Now, I did a little research online and I came up with the name Brandon Wright. So I believe the man being questioned and discussed in this portion of the documents is Brandon Wright, who was a friend of David Bell. Could possibly still be friends. I don't know. This portion of the documents is really hard to decipher because pretty much every single name is blacked out. But Wright does tell police that on the night in question, he was in fact with a unknown former roommate of one of his friends. Wright told police that he went to an event, then he went to the apartment where blank and blank lives. So he named two people, their names are blacked out. So he went to an event, he went to the apartment of two names that are blacked out. Wright then told police 3 names of friends that were also at the apartment, and also an unknown former roommate who he could not identify was also at the apartment. That means, including him, the 3 friends he named, and an unknown former roommate, that would be 5 people total at the apartment he was at before the thrill. 5 people. According to this statement, Wright told police that he got into his vehicle with one other person from the apartment they were at, and they drove to the thrill together, and the other 3 men got into a separate car and they drove to the thrill together. He also tells police that after the club, he got into his car and he drove back to Raleigh, North Carolina alone, while the other 4 dudes got into a car together and drove back to Durham together. So Brandon Wright leaves the club, gets in his car, heads back to Raleigh, North Carolina by himself, and then the other 4 dudes that he were with got into a separate vehicle and drove back to Durham together. So Brandon is basically saying, I exited stage left, these dudes got in their vehicle and they did whatever the fuck they did tonight. He's separating himself from the equation after the nightclub has ended. I called the number listed for blank and received his voicemail. I left a message for him to call me. Moments later, he called back. I told blank that I was investigating the death of Faith Hedgepeth and asked if he knew her. He said he met her that night at the thrill and they talked some. I told him that I was in the Durham area and was wondering if he would meet with me to view some footage from the thrill. Blank agreed to meet with me. I believe this portion of the documents that were released to the public is about the police interactions with David Bell. I think it's also very important to note that in this original statement, when the police originally called David Bell, he told the police on the phone that he had met Faith that night, the night in question, at the thrill. He met her at the thrill, meaning he met her for the first time at the thrill. Shortly after we arrived, blank pulled up in a black BMW. He parked his car and got into the front seat of my car. After some brief introductions, I told him again that I was investigating the death of Faith Hedgepeth and pulled out a photo of her showing it to him. Blank took a quick glance at the photo and then looked away. I asked him if that was the girl he talked to that night, and he said yes. I remember thinking to myself how odd blank seemed to react when he saw the photo of Faith, almost like he was ashamed. In this police statement, the police officer is talking about David Bell's odd reaction to the photo he showed David of Faith. Now, it never says in these court documents what photo was shown to David. Was it a photo of her from the crime scene? Bloody, dead, not alive? Was it a photo of her from high school? What photo did police show David Bell of Faith that made him have an odd reaction? Now, let's keep in mind, if it was a photo from the crime scene, anyone who sees that is probably going to have some type of reaction. If a cop just put me in an interrogation room and showed me photos of somebody that had been murdered at a crime scene, I'm probably going to have a horrified reaction. However, police did not describe David Bell's reaction as being horrified or scared or devastated. They described his reaction as ashamed, as if he was ashamed of maybe possibly what he did to Faith or his involvement that night of whatever happened to Faith. Could his reaction possibly be his guilt? Yeah. I put the photo away and asked him to tell me where he was at and who he was with prior to going to the thrill. Blank said that he was at his apartment, which he shares with blank, and that blank and their former roommate and friend blank was there. Blank stated that he, blank, and blank left the apartment together at approximately 2300 for the thrill, and that blank was driving his car. I asked blank if blank was with them when they left for thrill, and he stated that they ran into blank at the club and they met him there. This statement was suspicious to me, as I remember blank specifically telling me that he was at the apartment with the other men prior to them leaving for the club, and that blank rode with him to the club while the other men rode together in a separate car. So let's remember here, Brandon Wright told police that he went to blank's apartment, who he roomed with blank, and there was 3 other guys there and an unknown former roommate. Brandon told police that there was 5 people at the apartment before the thrill. However, David Bell, when interviewed by police, told police he was at his apartment with him and 2 other people, making it a total of 3 people at his apartment, which doesn't corroborate with Brandon Wright's story, who said there were 5 people at the apartment. So someone is lying. Is it Brandon or is it David? Or are both of them lying? David Bell then tells police that they drove his car to the thrill, but someone else was driving, but the name is blacked out, so I don't know who he said was driving his car, but David tells police that they took his car to the thrill. He wasn't driving, somebody else was that he was with. This again doesn't corroborate with Brandon Wright's story, because Brandon told police that he drove his car to the thrill with one other person from David's apartment that could have possibly been David, and then the other 3 dudes got into a separate vehicle and drove to the thrill. However, David's telling police that all of the 3 people that were at his apartment, including himself, got into his vehicle. Someone else drove his vehicle to the thrill and they headed out. Again, someone is lying. It's either David Bell or it's Brandon Wright, or both of them are lying. I think the police, knowing what Brandon Wright said in his questioning, they wanted to ask David Bell directly if he was with Brandon Wright at his apartment to see if him and David's stories would conflict yet again. So they asked David Bell straight up, were you with so-and-so, Brandon Wright, at your apartment before thrill? David tells police that he was not with Brandon Wright at his apartment. In fact, they met Brandon Wright at the club. So again, someone is lying. It's looking like David to me, but either Brandon or David is lying because their stories don't match at all, because Brandon told police that he was at David's apartment and drove to the thrill with one of the guys, possibly David, to the thrill. Now David's saying, no, Brandon Wright was not at my apartment. We met Brandon at the club. He went on his own. So which one is it? Was Brandon Wright at David's apartment with David and drove one of these motherfuckers to the club? Or did Brandon Wright lie about the whole situation and David's telling the truth? Or are both of them making up stories as they go along and not texting or calling each other to discuss their stories? Are they both trying to throw each other under the bus? Is one innocent? Is one guilty? What's going on? I asked blank if they stopped anywhere on the way to the thrill, and he said no. Blank said they arrived at the club where they stayed until closing and then left. He said he remembers talking to Faith inside the thrill and also outside of the club when they closed. Blank said that he had recently met Faith briefly the previous weekend and then saw her again on the night in question. I asked blank if he remembered walking out of the thrill with Faith that night at closing, and he said he wasn't sure, but may have. Blank said that he, blank, and blank left the club about minutes after walking outside and then drove back to his apartment. Blank said they may have made one stop at Wendy's restaurant on the way home. In David Bell's original phone call with police before he agreed to meet with them, he told them that he met Faith at the thrill on the night in question. However, in this statement that I just read, he told police that he had previously met with Faith the weekend before and also at the thrill on the night in question. So again, David is caught in a lie. Which one is it, David? Did you meet her the previous weekend, or did you meet her at the club on the night in question? This is a murder investigation, dude. You can't even remember the lies you just told police? Did you meet her on the night in question, or did you meet with her the weekend prior? And if he didn't meet her on the weekend prior, and that was a lie, was he trying to establish some type of relationship between the two, which could easily be established if Faith's text messages between each suspect were released to the public? If there is no contact between David and Faith prior to the night in question, he did not meet her on the previous weekend. He met her at the club. And if he met her at the club and somehow after the club tried to throw an advance at her, hit on her, try to get at her, and she said no, maybe rejection didn't sit well with David, and David got upset and possibly was involved with her rape and or murder. I'm just saying, whatever the truth is, David's not telling it because he's lying again. I'm just saying, why the minor discrepancy if David ain't got nothing to hide? Police asked David if he remembers walking out of the thrill with Faith on the night in question. He says he doesn't recall, but it's a possibility. Now, I don't know about y'all, but if I'm a man and I was engaging with a woman at a nightclub one night and then I woke up and all over the news was breaking headlines of how this woman was murdered and I was just with her at a club the night prior, every detail of that night and of the woman that I was just engaging with who is now murdered would be embedded in my memory. I'm pretty sure David would remember talking to her, walking her outside, engaging in any type of conversation, especially if he woke up in the morning and saw the news headlines that a woman was found dead in her apartment and it just happened to be the woman you were walking out of the club with on the night in question. But he don't remember? How convenient, David. Your memory seems to suck when it needs to be precise. How convenient, David. How convenient. I feel like David Bell doesn't remember walking out of the club with Faith because he doesn't want to admit to police that he was in fact one of the last few people to see Faith alive. Guilty, is guilty of something. David Bell is f***ing guilty, a piece of f***ing shit. David Bell tells police that when the club concluded, he and two of his friends got into his car and went back to his apartment. Again, this story doesn't corroborate with what Brandon Wright told police in his statement because Brandon said that he got into his car alone and drove back to Raleigh, North Carolina, when the other four men got into another vehicle and drove back to Durham together. Now, I'm just a little confused. Where is the missing person? There was 5 total. So we got Brandon Wright in his vehicle, leaving the club alone. Then we got David saying he got into the car with 2 of his boys, leaving the club to go back to his apartment. So that's 4 people. Who's this 5th person? Who's this 5th person that no one seems to be accounting for? Who? If Brandon Wright is telling the truth, David would have gotten into his vehicle with 3 other men, including himself, and not 2 other men, including himself. If David is lying, then who is the person he's leaving out of the story? Who does David not want to admit he was with? Now, remember, Brandon said there was an unknown former roommate of David's in the group that evening that he didn't know personally and just happened to not know his name, which is weird. So, is David covering up for someone? Because if Brandon is telling the truth, David was with one other person. Who's that other person? Who is it? Next, I explained to Blank I had a list of questions that I wanted to ask him and asked if he would be willing to go through the questionnaire, to which he agreed. I completed the questionnaire and Blank answered all of the questions. Then I asked Blank if he would be willing to submit a sample of his DNA, to which he replied, I don't feel comfortable doing that because I touched her that night. I told Blank that was fine if he did not want to submit, then asked if he would be willing to meet me at the police department next week to view more footage from the thrill, as we did not have the footage of the person believed to be him coming out of the club with Faith. Blank agreed to meet with me again, so I gave him my card and told him I would call him Monday. March 11, 2013, I asked Blank for his address, and he stated that he currently lives at Blank, Durham, North Carolina. Also mentioned that Blank was his former roommate when all this happened. Our conversation ended, and Blank left in his car. So this portion of the documents released to the public is where David Bell becomes even more suspicious to me. So he tells police he does not want to submit a sample of DNA because he might have touched her that night. Might have touched her. Okay, well, the DNA found at the crime scene was semen. So if David was not involved in the possible rape and murder of Faith, and he was not at her apartment on the night in question, then his DNA would not match the semen found at the crime scene, which would rule him out as a suspect. If David Bell touched her that night means I had sex with her, then the only way that would be possible and David wasn't involved in her murder would be if Faith had sex with him in the club or in her car or someone's car in the parking lot right before she went home and got murdered by somebody else. And that just doesn't seem like a plausible or realistic situation. However, if he touched her that night means David had sex with her that night, then it is possible that David went back to Karina and Faith's apartment after leaving the thrill and was one of the men involved in her possible rape and murder, and could possibly be one of the voices on the distorted voicemail. Let's all keep in mind and not forget that the DNA of the semen was also DNA found around Karina and Faith's apartment, which means the person whose semen was left in, around, or by Faith's body at the crime scene was also DNA found in other portions of the house, meaning whoever had sex or possibly had sex with Faith on the night she was murdered was also tiptoeing and chilling around the crib. David told police first that he just met Faith on the night in question at the thrill, but then he said, I met Faith previously on a weekend previously, and then again at thrill. So either way, Faith briefly has met David Bell. They are not fully acquainted. They don't know each other that well. I don't know how Faith was with men she just met. I don't know if they like to invite people over to the crib just to have them kick it. So if they did meet the previous weekend, maybe his DNA is at their apartment because he went there and hung out with them on a previous weekend. However, if he did just meet her that night at Thrill, the only way his DNA would ever be around the apartment is if he was around the apartment on the night in question, which means he's suspect number, he's up there. Eric Jones is still suspect number 1, is involved somehow, some way. But David Bell, if his DNA is in fact in the apartment of Karina and Faith, and he did actually just meet her that night at the thrill, he was there on the night of the murder. Because if they just previously met, his DNA ain't just gonna be chilling around the crib because he's never been there before. David Bell's refusal to submit DNA is enough proof for me to be like, he might have something to do with this murder. He might actually be one of the people involved, because for me it's like any man that is being accused of possible rape and first-degree murder would be willing to submit a sample to clear himself as a suspect. And his refusal to submit his DNA because he touched her that night, but then doesn't specifically explain to police what he meant by I touched her that night, just seems like no matter what happened and whatever degree he played in Faith's death, he did something he probably wasn't supposed to do to Faith. Because if they had sex and it was consensual, why wouldn't you just tell police that? But if he touched her that night and it wasn't what Faith wanted, and then she also got murdered, that's rape. That's still a crime. Whether you murdered her or not, he still could have raped her, because the refusal to give DNA don't make no sense to me. Unless, of course, he's guilty. For me, when I'm reading these court documents, I'm like, it's important to figure out how he was involved, which one of his friends he was with that was involved, how this knows Eric Jones, because Eric is 100% involved in Faith's murder somehow, some way. And to crack his friend group, because someone in that friend group knows David Bell's involvement and hasn't told police. Then in this police statement it says before David Bell got into his vehicle and left that he said that blank, name was blacked out, was his former roommate at the time of the murder. I also read online, I don't know if this is true or not, that David Bell is now a lawyer, and he was one of the people in the group that was in law school at the time. Now if that's the case, and David Bell was studying law, it could also be true that in his studies he could have learned how to avoid submitting samples of DNA to police, avoiding certain questioning, and how to get away with murder. If David Bell was in law school, he would have had possible more knowledge on how to avoid police and arrest than someone who was not in law school. And I think that's just important to note. Might mean nothing, might mean something. Looking deeper into the distorted voicemail that was analyzed by analysis, I originally hear Eric, Rosie, and Big Mike. However, in some of the audio, I realized that Dave's house is said. Now, in Brandon Wright's statement and in David Bell's statement to police, they both admitted to being at David's apartment before the thrill. So it can be confirmed that whoever was on this voicemail and possibly involved in the murder and possible rape of Faith either knows Dave or is Dave, because they were at Dave's house. So let's say David wasn't involved, although I believe that he is somehow. But let's say he wasn't. He would have knowledge on who was, because the person heard on the distorted voicemail, one of the men that was with Faith and Karina had been or was planning on going to Dave's house with Big Mike. Again, I put emphasis on the nickname Big Mike. We gotta figure out who the Big Mike is. I think finding out who Big Mike is the key to unraveling what happened to Faith that night. Big Mike is the key. I called the number listed for blank and received his voicemail. I left a message for him to call me. Moments later, I received a call from blank. I asked blank if he would still be willing to meet with me to view the footage from the thrill, and he said he would. Blank arrived on time, and we went to my office to talk. I asked him to tell me again where he was at and who he was with prior to arriving at the thrill on the night in question. Blank said that he was at a law school function at Champ's restaurant and recalls watch portions of the Democratic National Convention. Blank said he left there and went to blank and blank apartment where they watched President Obama's speech. Blank said that blank, 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 and the unknown former roommate of Bird and Bell were at the apartment. Wright said that they all left the apartment for the thrill at approximately 2300 and that he and blank rode together to the thrill. I specifically asked blank if it was just him and blank, and he said yes. Blank believes that the unknown roommate drove his car and that blank and blank rode with him. Blank described the man's car as being white in color. I believe this portion of the court documents is when police brought Brandon Wright back in for re-questioning, because obviously him and David Bell's stories did not work well. Their stories did not add up. I will mention some of the things I noticed while reading these police statements that might be key factors into figuring out what happened that night. Police mention a new last name, Bird, unsure of his first name because his full name is blacked out, but Brandon Wright tells police that he was in fact at David Bell and Bird's apartment prior to going to the thrill. So Bird must be who David Bell was living with during the time this crime was committed. Again, Brandon Wright confirms with police that he was at David Bell's apartment with Bird. Again, Brandon Wright confirms that he was at the apartment with 3 other people and an unknown former roommate that used to live with David Bell and Bird, making that a total of 5 people at David's apartment. Could this unknown former roommate be Big Mike and the key to solving this entire mystery? Also, I have to note that I find it a bit odd that Brandon Wright did not know the name of this unknown former roommate. If you're going to somebody's apartment before going to the club, wouldn't you think that some type of introduction would be made, like, yo, Brandon, this is so-and-so, y'all dap it up, pour a shot of like tequila or Henny, introduce each other to one another. It's a little weird to me that this entire time Brandon can't give this unknown former roommate's name at all to police. Like, during that entire time y'all are pre-gaming to go to the club, you didn't get this dude's name or nickname, you didn't speak to each other once, you didn't hear him talking to somebody else in the apartment who called him by his name. That part of Brandon's story doesn't really sit well with me. It just doesn't make any sense. Also, if Brandon keeps mentioning to police this unknown former roommate, why in none of these police statements does it state that in their questioning of David Bell, they question him on the name of his former roommate? Because if David used to live with him, he would know the name of his old roommate. So why in none of this paperwork does it say this unknown former roommate's name? Why is he still being referred to as unknown former roommate as opposed to his actual name? Because David and Bird supposedly would know this unknown former roommate's name, yet he's still being referred to as this mysterious person. Why was David Bell just not asked, what's the name of your old roommate that was with you that night? What the I just think it's weird that in all the documents that are at least public, I don't see this question asked by police anywhere. And if this mysterious person's identity is the key to figuring out what the happened that night, wouldn't that be the #1 question being asked? Hey, so David, who was your old roommate? What's his name? What's his deal? Were you with him that night? Where did he go after the club? What's his contact information? Let's have an interview with him. Brandon Wright confirms with police that he got into his vehicle with one other guy from David Bell's apartment, possibly David, and drove to the thrill, while the other 3 men got into a separate vehicle and drove to the thrill. He believes that they got into the unknown former roommate's vehicle, and he believes that the unknown former roommate's car was white. And I'm going to put emphasis on the fact that Brandon said the car was white, because we're about to talk about Brandon Edwards, who's Karina Rosario's ex-boyfriend, and also one of the last people text from Faith's phone. His vehicle was searched during this investigation and his vehicle is white. So is it possible that this mysterious unknown former roommate of David Bell and Bird is Brandon Edwards? Because if it is Brandon Edwards, it would make sense how this group of men would be linked to Faith and Karina. So right now, this is what I've gathered from the police documents that I have deciphered with you. David Bell, Brandon Wright, unknown first name but last name Bird, who was David Bell's former roommate, but was the roommate of David Bell at the time of Faith's murder, another name that is still completely blacked out, and the unknown former roommate. So I've got 5 people from these court documents being discussed in regards to the apartment before the thrill and at the thrill. So there's a name outside of the mysterious unknown former roommate that's blacked out, and I don't know that person's name. Does this person know Faith? Was he involved somehow? We need to know the name of this last person that was also at the apartment. I asked Blank where they parked when they arrived at the thrill, and he described Town Parking Lot 2, which is at the corner of East Rosemary Street and North Columbia Street. I asked where the other men parked, and he said the same parking lot. Blank said the 5 of them total entered the thrill at approximately 23:45. I asked him if he met Faith Hedgepeth that night, and he said he never met her, but remembers Blank pointing her out and talking about how good she looked. I asked him if he remembers any of the men in his group talking to Faith, and he said no. Blank said he left the club that night around closing with a girl named Blank and stood outside with her and smoked a cigarette. Blank said that eventually all 5 of them walked back to the parking lot where they were parked. He further explained that blank, 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 and the unknown left the parking lot for Durham while he stayed behind for approximately 10 minutes smoking and gathering his bearings. Blank said he left the parking lot in his car alone and drove back to his home in Raleigh, North Carolina. I showed Blank the footage of the 4 men entering the thrill, and he identified blank, blank, unknown roommate, and himself in that order. So both vehicles parked in the same parking lot, and I'm assuming it's the same parking lot that Karina and Faith had parked in. The same parking lot that wasn't contacted in time for the security footage because it got recorded over and destroyed. Again, Brandon Wright confirms that a total of 5 of them entered the club. Brandon Wright tells police that he never met Faith, but he remembers his friend, whose name is blacked out, commenting on how good she looked that night. This was probably David Bell, or is it possible that more than one guy out of this group of friends had their eye on Faith? Police asked Brandon Wright if he saw any of his friends talking to Faith at the thrill on the night in question, and Brandon says no. However, David Bell tells police that he was dancing with Faith at the thrill nightclub, and he's seen on security footage leaving the nightclub with Faith. So unless Brandon just doesn't pay attention to his surroundings, how did he not see David Bell interacting and engaging, let alone dancing with Faith on the dance floor and walking out of the club with Faith? And when David and Faith are walking out of the nightclub on security footage, it's very clear they're in conversation with each other. She looks actually happy. So how does Brandon tell police that none of his friends talked to her that night? Either Brandon really didn't see any of his boys talking to her because he just wasn't paying attention or was uninterested, or he's lying to protect someone, possibly David. Brandon told police that he went outside to smoke a cigarette with some chick. Her name is blacked out. He then said eventually all 5 of them, meaning all 5 guys, walked to the parking lot together. Again, he said 5 of them. But had they all walked to the parking lot together as a group, wouldn't Brandon have seen David speaking to Faith? No? I believe Karina is also seen talking to a man when she's walking out of the club ahead of Faith. Was that also one of the guys in their friend group? Brandon Wright tells police that David Bell and 3 other guys got into a vehicle and left about 10 minutes before him to head back to Durham. Not once did Brandon Wright mention David driving, David's black BMW, because remember, David pulled up to talk to police in a black BMW, and not once did Brandon Wright mention that. He believes the car was white and it belonged to the unknown former roommate. Conflicting stories. The police statement states that Brandon was shown security footage of the 4 men walking into Thrill. However, hasn't Brandon been telling police this entire time that it was 5 of them at the apartment and 5 of them that entered the club? If this is the truth, then why are police showing Brandon footage of 4 men walking into the nightclub, not 5? Where is the 5th person that Brandon kept telling police about 1,000 times? And why didn't police question him about this 5th person? He keeps talking about how there was 5 people. 2 people in his car, 3 in the other car. If I'm a police officer and I'm showing him footage of 4 people walking in the club, my first question is going to be, so where's the 5th person that you were with? Because there's only 4 of y'all motherfuckers walking in the club. Where's the 5th person that you've been telling me about during this entire investigation? Nowhere in the police statements did police ask Brandon where the 5th person was at. Nowhere. The statement then says he identified blank, blank, unknown roommate, and himself in that order. If this police statement is true, that means that Brandon Wright identified himself and 3 other men, not 5 people. So the question is, where is the 5th person that Brandon told police was at the apartment and went to the club with them? Where is this 5th person? Did the 5th person walk in after them? Did he drop them off at the club then dib? But then he tells police that all 4 men got into a car and headed back to Durham later, so the 5th person must have been in the club. Or was there never a 5th person at the apartment and at Thrill with this group of friends? Either way, this proves to me that Brandon Wright doesn't have his stories together and is lying, or police didn't catch this discrepancy and didn't question him about it when they should have. I looked online for the security footage of this group of men walking into the Thrill nightclub or walking out of the nightclub, and I couldn't find shit anywhere online. The only footage that I could see about 6 seconds of is Karina and Faith walking out of the nightclub with David Bell, or Faith with David Bell. There is no footage of this group of men available anywhere. But if police have it, why does the public not have it? Why is that security footage a big secret? Why can't the public view the footage? Maybe if the public views the footage, someone who was at the club that night could tell police something that they didn't notice while watching it. Just like I'm noticing in this police statement that they didn't even ask Brandon a simple question like, where the f is the 5th person at? Also makes you question, what other footage does police have that the public doesn't know about? What other information does the police have that the public doesn't know about? I asked Link if he would be willing to answer the questions on the questionnaire, and he said yes. We went through the questionnaire, and Blank answered all of the questions. I then asked him to submit a sample of his DNA, to which he agreed. I collected the sample of DNA, and our meeting concluded. So this portion of this court documents that was released gives whether Brandon's story was a little flawed. He was willing to give a sample of his DNA to prove he was not guilty or involved in Faith's death, which makes me believe he probably wasn't involved in the murder, despite the fact he might be aware of who was involved. Because his homeboy David Bell, he refused to give a sample. Brandon Wright gave it. David Bell refused. March 12th, 2013. I called the number listed for blank and received his voicemail. I left a message again asking that he contact me as soon as possible. Unsure of who the police called and left a voicemail to because the name is blacked out, but after this page in the court documents, there is no update on Brandon Bell or his group of friends. There's no update on the unknown former roommate, David Bell, Brandon Wright, Bird, the other name that was blacked out and never revealed, Loftus, the guy that worked at Red Robin, Chris White, the former employee at Thrill, and everyone that was mentioned is not mentioned again after this note in the file. And I have tons of questions. I'm sure you guys have tons of questions, but there is nothing available for us to review or dissect. The only other document is, it looked like a warrant was going to be served to get a sample of DNA, and then there's a note that upon this guy's second interview, he gave a sample of his DNA, therefore they didn't serve him the warrant. I'm unsure of who this is in regards to because the name is blacked out. I believe that it was in fact David Bell because it says in the paperwork that this person was seen leaving the club with Faith and his DNA is required to prove that he wasn't involved in this murder. And it said upon a second interview he gave a sample of his DNA despite being reluctant. So if that is the case and this paperwork does belong to David Bell and he eventually submitted a DNA sample and no one has been arrested thus far, then David Bell was not involved in Faith's murder, which doesn't make sense because he touched her that night and I don't know what that means. What does he mean by that? So I don't want to confirm or deny that this in fact is about David Bell. I also don't want to entirely rule out the fact that he could possibly be involved, but if he did submit a sample of his DNA and that DNA didn't match the DNA at the crime scene, then it's impossible for him to be involved in this murder unless of course the murder was committed elsewhere and the body was just brought back to Karina and Faith's apartment and Faith was still alive and tried to book it, and therefore someone picked up a bottle of Bacardi and bashed her in the head with it to stop her and eventually killed her. There's so many different possibilities. I just from the conflicting stories and the lying believe David Bell has more to tell police than he's willing to. Brandon Edwards, who was Karina's ex, who was one of the last texts sent from Faith's phone, was also questioned by police. Now let's keep in mind that Brandon told police that he stayed at Karina and Faith's apartment the night before on September 5th, 2012. He slept there at their apartment, he woke up and left their apartment at around 11 a.m. and then saw him again that evening at Thrill nightclub. It was also rumored that both girls liked Brandon and maybe there was hostility between the two because they both liked him and maybe Brandon liked Faith and didn't like Karina. I'm not sure. Allegedly, they both had a thing for Brandon. In regards to Brandon Edwards, on September 11th, a search warrant was actually issued to search a white 1997 Honda Accord that belonged to a man named Ronnie L. Edwards. It's unclear to me and it's unclear to the internet and everyone looking in if Ronnie and Brandon are related. They have the same last name, so they could be, but that was the vehicle that they were searching. When they did the search of this white Honda Accord, they took 4 swabs, 2 from the backseat cushion on the driver's side and 2 more swabs from the door frame on that same side. There is no update anywhere online. I'm gonna go ahead and assume that the details in regards to this search of this vehicle is sealed for whatever reason, so I'm unsure of if they found anything in this vehicle linked to Faith's homicide. So Brandon Edwards, he had a white Honda Accord. Brandon Wright believes that the unknown former roommate had a white car that could possibly fit with Brandon Edwards. The white Honda Accord was searched. I'm unsure, the public's unsure of who Ronnie Edwards is. Maybe his dad. We don't know, but the car was registered to Ronnie Edwards, but it was Brandon Edwards' car and it was searched. If Brandon Edwards' car is the car of the unknown former roommate, that means that Brandon Edwards knows David Bell, and that means that David Bell knew Faith and Karina through Brandon Edwards, and it's a possibility that maybe Brandon Edwards was involved in whatever crimes were committed that evening. What I find interesting and what I would love an answer to is why they only searched or swabbed the driver's side of the vehicle. Why those specific areas, and what were they looking for when they swabbed the vehicle? Why didn't they just test the entire vehicle for DNA evidence? What were they looking for? Who did they believe was in the car, and what did this search conclude? I would love answers to those questions. In regards to Brandon Edwards, first part of the search search warrant reads, description of crime, death investigation. Description of vehicle to be searched, a white in color 1997 Honda Accord bearing North Carolina registration plate YZW-6967, vehicle identification number blank, registered to blank. The vehicle is in the custody of the Chapel Hill Police Department and will be searched in a controlled environment at a law enforcement facility. In Brandon's search warrant, it states that affiant made contact with blank via phone on September 9, 2012 at 5:36 p.m. So somebody called Brandon at 5:36 p.m. on September 9th. Affiant requested that blank come to the Chapel Hill Police Department and be interviewed about Hedgepeth's death. Blank agreed and arrived at the police department about 10 a.m. on September 10th, 2012. He was interviewed about his relationship with Rosario and Hedgepeth. Blank told affiant that he was with Rosario in Hedgepeth on September 5th, 2012 and actually spent the night on the couch in their apartment that evening. According to Blank, he left the residence around 11 a.m. on September 6th, 2012. Blank had contact with Rosario in Hedgepeth again on the evening of September 6, 2012 into the morning hours of September 7th at Thrill, a nightclub in Chapel Hill. Blank alleges that he did not have any contact with Hedgepeth after leaving Thrill that morning. Then it continues to say, through affiant's training and experience, affiant believes that by processing Blank's vehicle, affiant investigators can determine whether there is trace evidence, meaning face blood, that Blank entered the vehicle after the crime was committed. Processing blank vehicle is necessary to corroborate his story of having no involvement in the death of Hedgepeth. So basically, cops believe that maybe, this is what I'm getting from the search warrant, that Karina is possibly lying, and it wasn't that she got in the car with Jordan. She actually got in the car with Brandon, because if they are adamant in checking this vehicle for traces of Faith, such as blood or hair or fibers, in the vehicle, that means that they believe Karina is involved, and so is Brandon. So maybe Brandon is also a prime suspect. Maybe Brandon is Big Mike. Maybe the third person in the voicemail that's very hard to understand is Brandon. But there is a reason the results of this search warrant are sealed and unavailable to the public. Questions I have after reading these search warrants. Number 1, was Brandon Edwards confirmed to be the unknown former roommate? 2, if Brandon Edwards stayed at Karina and Faith's apartment on September 5th, wouldn't his DNA be confirmed to be in the apartment? He stayed there, probably showered there, probably brushed his teeth there. His DNA would probably be all over them. Yes or no? Number 3, why has the search of his vehicle never been released to the public if, in fact, he is not a suspect? Number 4, if he was, in fact, close friends with both Karina and Faith, why did he text Faith's phone, "Who is this?" as if he didn't have her number saved? That doesn't make sense to me. Wouldn't you have your homegirl's number saved in your phone? Number 5, if Brandon Edwards is in fact the unknown former roommate of David Bell and Bird, and he was the one that drove a portion of this group of guys to the Thrill that evening, wouldn't their DNA or traces of that group of guys' DNA be in his vehicle, which could have been collected with the search warrant of the white Honda Accord and then tested and matched against the semen found at the crime scene? Therefore, confirming to the police if any of the men who went in his vehicle to the Thrill were involved and faced possible rape and murder. Because remember, some of these guys refused to give DNA. But had they been in Brandon Edwards' car, if he is in fact the unknown former roommate, and they tested the entire vehicle for trace evidence, some of that DNA could have been tested against the DNA or semen found at the crime scene and been a possible match. Which makes me question why the vehicle was only swabbed in 2 places and not completely traced. Because if they tested the entire vehicle for fingerprints and or DNA, this could have narrowed the suspect pool to whoever was riding in that car to the Thrill at the night in question. That only works if in fact Brandon Edwards is the unknown former roommate that drove some of these men to the Thrill. This theory only works if he is in fact the former roommate. On the morning of Saturday, September 8th, 2012, investigator L. Balsaman of the Chapel Hill Police Department interviewed Marisol Rangel. Rangel was a close friend of Hedgepeth and was at the apartment with Rosario when Hedgepeth's body was discovered. Among other things, Marisol told Balsaman that a male by the name of blank dated Rosario and had a physical relationship with her, but was currently just a friend. Bosselman researched blank's name and obtained his phone number. Investigator B. Walker imaged Hedgepeth's cell phone and printed text messages from her phone for the dates of September 6th and 7th, 2012. Affiant reviewed the printed text messages and discovered 2 that were sent from Hedgepeth's phone to the phone number blank on the morning of her death. The first message was sent at 3:40 a.m. Through Affiant's training and experience, Affiant has probable cause to believe that the text messages to phone number blank from Hedgepeth's phone were intended for blank. I also find it interesting that there are police statements released about police's conversations or interactions with certain suspects in the public court documents, but there is absolutely no police statements or conversations or anything on Brandon Edwards, Marisol Rangel, Karina Rosario, or Eric Tacoy Jones. Why is that? I do believe that Brandon Edwards does know who was involved in this crime if he was not involved himself. A part of me also believes that Brandon was sent a text from Faith's phone from Karina to get Brandon to show up to the apartment, find Faith's dead body, and somehow get the blame for her death. Or another possible scenario is Brandon was actually with Karina. They took Faith's phone, they texted Brandon from Faith's phone to make it seem like Brandon and Karina were not together during the murder, and therefore establishing some type of alibi for one another. Another suspect was Reginald Leonard Jackson II. He had been texting and talking to Faith. He was hard to catch up with, but when the police eventually caught up to him, he said he doesn't do police, he doesn't talk to police. Police isn't something that he's interested in. Again, I couldn't find anything online of whether or not his DNA was taken, if he refused to give his DNA, but he was also a suspect. Some guy that was texting Faith. This is what the report said, and I'm going to read it because it's long again, about him. I, Nathan L. Chambers with the Chapel Hill Police Department, would like to make the following statement, and I affirm that all statements are true. On November 16th, 2012, I spoke to blank by telephone. I informed Mr. Blank that I was calling him because his name had come up in the death investigation of Faith Hedgepeth. I informed Mr. Blank that I wanted to speak to him in person to ask him a few questions. I stated to Mr. Blank that I could come to Greensboro to meet with him, when he stated that it was fine. I asked Mr. Blank what was his address, and he gave me blank, Greensboro, North Carolina. I asked Mr. Blank what time did he want to meet, and he stated to me after 5. On November 19th, 2012, I attempted to make contact with Mr. Blank several times by telephone, office, and cell phones to confirm our meeting, and he did not answer his phone. I also sent Mr. Blank a text message from my cell phone in which he did not respond to. On November 19th, 2012, at 1600 hours, I left Chapel Hill Police Department en route to blank. I arrived around 1700 hours at blank and parked my car outside the 804 building. I called Greensboro 911 Communications and informed the dispatcher that I was Investigator Chambers with the Chapel Hill Police Department, and I was requesting that a Greensboro officer meet me at blank in reference to attempting to locate a subject. The dispatcher asked me if the subject had warrants, and I stated to her that he did not and that I was looking for the subject for questioning in a case that I was investigating. The dispatcher stated that she would have an officer to meet me as soon as possible. Around 1730, Officer Fleming with Greensboro Police Department arrived, and I briefed him on why I was there. Officer Fleming and I went to apartment 3C, and he knocked on the door twice but received no answer. Upon leaving the door, I informed Officer Fleming that the subject drove an Acura, and we noticed that there was an Acura sitting in the parking lot. Officer ran the tag on the Acura, but it did not come back to Mr. Blank. While standing in the parking lot with Officer Fleming, I noticed a maroon-colored 4-door Acura with dark-tinted windows pulling into the parking lot. I stated to Officer Fleming, "Here comes an Acura." The vehicle drove past us, and Officer Fleming got the tag number and ran it on his patrol's car MCT. Officer Fleming stated that the vehicle came back to Mr. Blank and that the tags were expired. The vehicle came back around and passed us again, and Officer Fleming asked me if I wanted him to stop the vehicle, and I stated yes. The vehicle left out of the parking lot and made a right onto Blank. Officer Fleming pulled out of the parking lot, and I followed behind him. The maroon-colored Acura made a right at the first stoplight, and so did Officer Fleming and myself. Shortly after making the right, I saw Officer Fleming activate his emergency lights, and the maroon Acura made a right onto a side street and stopped just past the stop sign. I pulled my vehicle behind Officer Fleming and waited until made his approach to the vehicle. I then got out and approached Officer Fleming's patrol vehicle from the right side. I stood by while Officer Fleming talked to the driver. Officer Fleming asked the driver to step out of the vehicle, and the driver walked back to me. I recognized the driver to be Blank. I asked Mr. Blank if he saw me standing outside in the parking lot of his apartment complex, and he stated that he did, and that's why he kept going. That doesn't look guilty at all or anything. Mr. Mr. Blank stated that he did not want to talk to me and that he had nothing to say. I asked Mr. Blank why he hadn't returned any of my calls, and he stated that he did not want to talk. I stated to Mr. Blank that he was not in any trouble and I wanted to know how he knew Faith Hedgepeth, and he stated I know of her. I asked Mr. Blank why he just didn't call and cancel if he did not want to talk, and he stated that he was sorry for wasting my time and he does not talk to police like that. I asked Mr. Blank a last time if he was going to sit down and talk to me, and he stated no, and I stated okay. Officer Fleming gave Mr. Blank a verbal warning to get his tags corrected, and Mr. Blank left the traffic stop. I'm going to go ahead and assume that this guy also did not give his DNA. And he seems very rude, he seems non-compliant, and he seems kind of like he's got a criminal-ass attitude, so I'm not quite sure if he didn't want to give DNA because he's guilty or if he didn't want to give DNA because that shit'll fuck up his other crimes that he possibly committed. But he also doesn't seem like a good dude at all. It's kind of weird, like both Karina and Faith didn't surround themselves with good men. Pretty much every single person that has been mentioned in this true crime, at least the men, seem like pieces of fucking shit. All of them. Or they seem like gangsters. Either or, it's kind of crazy that someone with a good head on her shoulders surrounded herself with people that seemed not so good. Reginald Leonard Jackson II, this mother right here. There was an affidavit in these court documents released to the public that was looking to obtain a sample of DNA from this suspect, as he may have committed the offense. It's clear to me that this affidavit is for Reginald because it mentions the officer Chambers, who was the one that drove all the way down to kind of scoop him up, and also the fact that he was texting Faith before her murder, and also that he tried to avoid police, which was also very clear in Detective Chambers' police statement. So this affidavit was in fact for Reginald, to my belief. Outside of this one-page affidavit, there is nothing in the public records that confirm that they received a sample of DNA from Reginald. So it is unclear to me to this day whether or not they successfully got Reginald's DNA to test against the DNA found at the crime scene. There is also no documents anywhere that talk about the context of him and Faith's text messages with one another or their relationship. Did they know each other through a mutual friend? Were they romantic? It's unclear what exactly him and Faith were texting about a week before her murder, and why in fact they were only texting for a week. Whether a man is down with police or not, wouldn't you think that if it came down to a possible rape and murder charge, he'd want to clear his name and hence give a sample of his DNA? So it's really confusing to me why Reginald absolutely refused to not only give a sample of his DNA, but to talk to police in general. He didn't even want to have a conversation with them, stating that he didn't have nothing to say. His actions to me are actions of a very guilty man, refusing to even have a conversation about a woman that you were texting merely a week ago who is now murdered. You are acting like someone who is guilty of something, for sure. So the questions I have about Reginald is, how did he know Faith? What was the context of their relationship? Was a sample of DNA ever given and tested? Does Reginald know Eric Jones? Does Reginald know David Bell? Was he one of the people at David Bell's apartment? And why is none of this listed publicly anywhere? I was rereading these court documents and I was looking for some type of connection between David Bell and Reginald. I remember reading a detective's statement about David Bell and seeing the name Detective Chambers. I'll insert that right here. So I guess to me it's like, how many suspects did Detective Chambers interview? And was the person that submitted their DNA but then said they didn't want Detective Chambers to have the DNA, was that Reginald? Could that have possibly have been him? And if a person gives their DNA but then retracts and says I don't want you to have my DNA, are they still allowed to test it and use it? If the statement in David Bell's portion of the police reports is in regards to Reginald, that means Reginald knows David and was possibly at David Bell's apartment prior to going to the Thrill, which means he could have possibly been with David after leaving the Thrill and possibly have been with Karina and Faith and involved in her murder. Could David Bell and Reginald be involved somehow in Faith's murder together? Okay, so one thing I want to mention about Eric is, one, his odd behavior. As I said previously recorded, the FBI said that the person they were looking for would be oddly invested in the case, putting themselves basically in the spotlight to be interviewed, acting like they cared about the person, showing sympathy. We all know that Eric did not like Faith, yet he was doing interviews, he was acting like a concerned citizen. But what I found in the court documents regarding Eric, Faith, and Karina is actually kind of unsettling, and I'm going to go ahead and read what was in this search warrant. On September 7th, 2012, while the officers were processing the scene at 5639 Old Chapel Hill Road, Durham, North Carolina, Blank arrived and agreed to go to the police department to speak with officers at the Chapel Hill Police Department. So that means Eric went out of his way to go to police at the crime scene when they were working it and was willing to be questioned. This is basically what the FBI said the person that did the crime was going to be behaving like. He showed up to the crime scene and he offered to be questioned. After the interview was complete, Blank returned to the crime scene and walked right up to the crime scene tape. Officers had to ask him to leave because Rosario's 50B was still active against Jones and she needed to return to her apartment. So he goes to get interviewed by police and then returns to the crime scene to watch what's happening. Better yet, to see if they found anything or if he left anything behind. He also ignored his restraining order that was issued against him with Karina and still showed up to their apartment in the crime scene. And the FBI said that the person who committed this crime would be doing odd shit like showing up at candlelight vigils or showing up to the crime scene. At the time of Hedgepeth's death, Blank resided and is still living in the same apartment complex as Hedgepeth and Rosario. His apartment was located just a few buildings down from the apartment where Hedgepeth was found dead. There is also a search warrant in these court documents for a 2012 Jeep Patriot that is Eric's vehicle. So during this investigation, FBI said that the killer would start acting irrationally. They would start wanting to participate in the crime, trying to help out. They would do interviews. And when this murder initially happened, Eric was doing that. Despite hating Faith and even threatening to kill her, he did interviews about how she was a great person and whoever did this deserves to burn, and he did a lot of interviews and he was acting not his normal self, which is exactly what the FBI, the behavior of the killer. Again, Eric looking guilty along with his text messages and his tweets and his Facebook posts. Eric Tacoy Jones. Nowhere in these documents that I've seen publicly was Eric's alibi ever listed. What was he doing at the time of the murder? You know what else isn't listed in the court documents? The time the murder was committed. What time did Faith die? Why is that not released? Eric's name is clearly heard in the distorted voicemail left on Faith's friend's phone. So whether his DNA matched the semen found at the scene, Eric was in fact with Faith at some point during the evening and is in fact 110% involved in her death. The police have focused too much on the semen found around the body, which is probably exactly what Eric and Karina wanted them to do. Eric's DNA would have been in their apartment. He used to live there. He is involved in Faith's murder. That much we know. The key to all this is Karina, then Eric, and then everyone else. We just gotta figure out everyone else that's involved. That's it. Were Karina and Eric texting each other prior to Faith's murder, despite Karina having a restraining order? Did they have phone calls? Did they have text exchanges? I'm sure the police looked into that. So why isn't that public record? What was the status of Karina and Eric's relationship prior to Faith's death? If Eric was obsessed with Karina, as we can all assume he was, he would have no problem trying to make her happy, including committing a crime or helping her cover up one. So if Karina premeditated and planned to set up Faith and kill her, she knew Eric would help her or have her back. Or if this was a crime of passion and in the heat of the moment, Karina hit her in the head and killed her, she also would know that Eric would help her commit this crime and or help her clean it up. Karina probably knew that she could get Eric to commit the murder or at least help her clean up the murder she committed herself. So this is where I'm a little confused. The DNA found on the body at the crime scene was also DNA that was found all over the apartment. However, Brandon was at the apartment on the 5th, so his DNA would have been all over the apartment. Eric used to live with Karina in that apartment, so his DNA would have been all over the apartment. Ty, Faith's ex-boyfriend, frequently went in and out of that apartment, so his DNA would be all over that apartment. So all of them would have left traces of their DNA all over the apartment. Yet somehow DNA didn't match all of them because they're going off simply the DNA left on the body. So who's to say they didn't plant semen on the body to make it look like a rape, and therefore eyes weren't looked at DNA that would actually be found in the apartment? Meaning that Brandon, Eric, or Ty all could be responsible for this murder. I understand that none of their DNA matched the semen, but there's no way in hell their DNA didn't match DNA collected in the house, especially since Brandon slept there the night before on the 5th. His DNA would have absolutely 1010% been in that apartment. Now let's say Karina and Eric were involved in Faith's death. That's the Rosie in the recorded voicemail. That means that the semen that was found on the body that has not been matched to anyone could match the third person named on that voicemail, named Big Mike, because I did not read anything online about who the Big Mike was. It's a big old fashioned question mark. If Big Mike left his semen on the body after they did whatever they did to Faith, that could link Karina, Eric, and Big Mike all together in this murder. And maybe, just maybe, that's why no one has been arrested yet. Maybe investigators are waiting to figure out who Big Mike is so they can get not just one, but get all 3 people involved. That's what my theory is. I believe the girls came home from the nightclub. I believe at some point Eric and Big Mike went to their apartment. A scuffle happened. She might have been fighting them. They were scrambling when they realized she was dead because she got hit in the head with a bottle. And when you get hit in the head with a random bottle of Bacardi peach rum, it's probably because Faith was fighting back and they freaked out and grabbed what they could to subdue her. And in the action of subduing her, they killed her. So my guess is after they realized that Faith was dead, they started to panic and they were like, what are we gonna do? Like, we're gonna get arrested for this. We're gonna get in trouble for this. And so Eric, Karina, and Big Mike came up with this plan to stage it like a rape, planted semen on the body, knowing maybe Big Mike didn't have a record, so they weren't gonna find his DNA in the jail system or whatever little technology thing they use. And then they were like, we all have to leave and you need to get an alibi. So she started calling Brandon, like she was upset about Brandon, hoping that Brandon would answer, and he didn't. But then it's weird because she texted Brandon from Faith's phone that he didn't know was Faith's phone and asked him to come over. And maybe they wanted Brandon to go to the crib to find the body dead so Brandon could get blamed for the murders. And Brandon didn't answer. Oh my god, I literally just solved the case. I have goosebumps. That's why she was contacting Brandon. Brandon didn't answer. So then they thought, okay, let's text Brandon from Faith's phone. Let's try to see if he can come over. He can get blamed for this. He doesn't respond until the next day at 4 p.m. Then they're like, okay, let's text Ty from Faith's phone. Maybe Ty will show up because he loves Faith, and then he'll find Faith, and then he'll get blamed for Faith's murder because everyone already knows he's abusive. I think they panicked and they were trying to get anyone to come over to find the body, so therefore Karina didn't have to. Oh my god, you guys, I literally just solved this whole case. I'm not kidding. So Karina then is like freaking out, and Eric is telling her to be cool, and she needs an alibi, so she has to go. So she calls a guy she knows and she goes to another guy's house. This is the only part that's questionable because Eric's a psycho and he's very protective over Karina. He would never want Karina to go to another man's house in his presence, but at the same time he doesn't want his girl to go to jail. So if that's the only way they can get away from murder, I can see Eric being cool with that. Yeah, okay, if that's how we're gonna not get caught for murder, then we're not gonna get caught for murder. Do what you gotta do. And then I think Karina finally got one of these dudes to pick up her phone call, pick her up, bring her to another dude's house, and then somehow they got Marisol involved. Now, allegedly, Eric hung out with some gangsters. I don't know if this is true. I don't know if he's gang affiliated. But if you know it's really bad people, or if you're Marisol, or if you're Karina, and you know that they just killed Faith, like he did what he said he was gonna do, and he just killed Faith. If they put you in a position where you have no choice but to lie, and you're petrified for your own life, you're probably gonna do that. Unless somehow Marisol's nickname is Rosie, and it was Marisol that was at the crib and it wasn't Karina. But I'm gonna go ahead and assume that my theory was that Karina, some dude named Big Mike, and Eric were involved. And Marisol somehow maybe got threatened in the middle of the night and got herself involved too. But that's my theory. And Rosie and Big Mike are all responsible for causing Faith some type of harm on the night in question. We have to establish, one, who Big Mike is, we kind of already all know who Rosie is. And then we gotta establish what role each person played in whatever was done to Faith. Although the voicemail, the distorted voicemail, only 4 voices total were recognized, 2 male and 2 female, I believe there were more people involved in this crime, whether the voicemail caught their voices or not. I think David Bell, Reginald Jackson II, and Jacob Beatley were somehow involved. I also believe that Jacob Beatley and Reginald have committed crimes prior. I also believe that there has not been enough focus on the former UNC soccer player Jordan, who picked up Karina on the night in question, who was also identified by one of the men in David Bell's group of friends on the security footage at the Thrill. I feel like Jordan is an accessory to a degree. If he was not involved in the murder, he knows who was involved. I think police need to reapply pressure to certain suspects and people. They need to reopen this case, even though it's not closed, but go back to the beginning like it's day one. One of these people in this group of friends will crack. And before I finish this video, we need to remember other names that were mentioned. Chris White, only name in the entire public record whose name was not blacked out. Loftus, who was a co-worker of Faith at the Red Robin, who also had a criminal past. Bird, who was a roommate of David Bell at the time of Faith's murder. Another possible scenario is Karina and Faith went back to their apartment alone. They were drinking. They got into a heated argument about a boy or other things or such, and in that heated argument, it got physical. And in a fit of rage, Karina attacked her, hitting her over the head with a bottle that was close by, the Bacardi bottle. Karina then decided, I need to get the out of this apartment. She left the apartment to whatever guy would answer her call or text. She left the door unlocked, so it would be easy to explain why someone went into the apartment to then attack Faith. So she got an alibi, she left the door unlocked, and essentially she could get away with murder if in fact she committed this crime on her own. This is only a theory, and this theory would only work if in fact Faith was not raped, which was never revealed to the public whether or not she was. Karina was interviewed over 10 times by police, which means they do not believe her story, or something isn't adding up. Karina is the key to all of this. Period. And it's so weird because I had my headphones in and I was like listening to something. And as I was watching the Crime Watch Daily story on this case, and as I was listening, my headphones electrocuted me. Like, I had to rip them out of my ear. And as I did that, I pressed pause. And as I pressed pause, it was on an image of Eric Jones. It was just his face. And it was as if Faith spiritually was telling me through the screen, this is who killed me. Because it was when I was taking notes on her case at like 2 o'clock in the morning. And I got chills. I even took a screenshot, which I'll insert here, of my computer screen of when I took it. And I'm so freaked out by it because I literally felt like it was her telling me, this is who murdered me. Please help me solve this case. And that's why it was so important for me to do this video, because anyone who knows anything, please come forward. Give this family some peace. It has been 11 years and they have no answers. But someone knows something. Someone out there knows exactly what went down that night. And they're not saying anything. They're not even saying anything for $40,000, which means they're probably petrified for themselves. So let's note that Karina didn't go to any of the candlelight vigils. She didn't even go to Faith's funeral. Now, if that's your best friend and your roommate of years, why wouldn't you go to any of the candlelight vigils? Why wouldn't you be present at our funeral? Karina overall is just a piece of shit. I can't stand her. I hate people like her, friends like her, jealous, insecure. I don't know what her deal is, but she is suspect number 1 in my book. She probably got Eric to do this. She was probably behind the mastermind behind Faith's murder. I don't know, but Karina and Eric are the 2 people I believe were involved in this, and the missing link and the reason this case hasn't been solved is they need to figure out who the Big Mike is. So if you know, if you're watching this video and you know who Big Mike is, you probably know who the killer is and you can solve this case. Can solve it. Call the police department now. All that information will be in the description box below. Karina actually left North Carolina and went back to New Jersey to be with family. And my question is, did you run away because of guilt, or did you run away because you're running from someone? Possibly someone who threatened you if you ever opened your mouth and spoke about what happened that night. In Marisol's interview with ABC, she said that she's scared every day of her life. She doesn't know who she can trust, and until the murder of this case is found, she'll probably never be able to sleep. Now, if Marisol wasn't involved in the actual murder and she got bamboozled into participating in the end, she's now involved in this crime. Like, she would actually get jail time. But if she, in fact, got threatened, if she ever opened her mouth and she's petrified for her life and is living in fear every single day, that sounds like someone who's scared and knows what happened and is too petrified of death and of being murdered to speak on it. But Marisol, I know I talk shit about you all video. If that's the case, and you know what happened, I think for the love of God and to live in some type of peace, it's time. It's time to come forward. If you know something, more of what you're saying, like you're the one who made the 911 call and you were forced to do it, or in fact you were complicit in the crime, don't you think it's time to clear your conscience? Because you know something, girl. We all know you know something. We all know it. Warned people about. Now, to this day, this is not a cold case. The case has never been turned into a cold case. In fact, is an open case, which to me makes me believe that cops didn't seal the records because they're trying to hide the mistakes they made, because mistakes are made in probably a lot of cases. I think they're hiding a lot of the details because they don't want the killer to know, or the killers to know, how much evidence they have stacked against them. Now, the reason I feel like no one has been arrested is because there's a third person and there's a missing link / DNA missing in this case, and they are waiting to figure out who that belongs to so they can make the proper arrest. If they arrest anyone right now, it could be argued that they have reasonable doubt. To a jury, for people watching, a case would not be solid. I do believe in my heart of hearts that the cops know who killed Faith. They just need more evidence. And in order to get more evidence, they need people to start talking. So if you know anything, or you know anyone that knows anything, I encourage you to come forward. Because you gotta think, if that was your aunt, your mom, your sister, your cousin, who was murdered in the way that Faith was murdered, you would want somebody to come forward and speak up for them. So now it's time for you to speak up for Faith.